There have always been men who have asked, "Where are we going?" But never, it would seem, have there been so many of them. And surely never before have these myriads of questioners asked their question in such dolorous tones, or rephrased their question in such despairing words. Can man survive? Even on a less cosmic basis, questioners appear on all sides, seeking meaning or identity, or even the most narrowly egocentric basis, trying to find myself. One of these persistent questions is typical of the 20th century rather than of earlier times. Can our way of life survive? Is our civilization doomed to vanish as did that of the Incas, the Sumerians, and the Romans? From Giovanni Battista Vico in the early 18th century to Oswald Spengler in the early 20th century, and Arnold J. Toynbee in our own day, men have been puzzling over the problem whether civilizations have a life cycle and follow a similar pattern of change. From this discussion has emerged a fairly general agreement that men live life in separately organized societies, each with its own distinct culture, that some of these societies, having writing and city life, exist on a higher level of culture than the rest, and should be called by the different term, civilizations, and that these civilizations tend to pass through a common pattern of experience. From these studies, it would seem that civilizations pass through a process of evolution which can be analyzed briefly as follows. Each civilization is born in some inexplicable fashion, and after a slow start, enters a period of vigorous expansion, increasing its size and power both internally and at the expense of its neighbors, until gradually a crisis of organization appears. When this crisis has passed and the civilization has been reorganized, it seems somewhat different. Its vigor and morale have weakened. It becomes stabilized and eventually stagnant. After a golden age of peace and prosperity, internal crises arise again. At this point, there appears, for the first time, a moral and physical weakness which raises, also for the first time, questions about the civilization's ability to defend itself against external enemies. Racked by internal struggles of a social and constitutional character, weakened by a loss of faith in its older ideologies and by challenge of newer ideas and incompatible with its past nature, the civilization grows steadily weaker until it is submerged by outside enemies and eventually disappears. When we come to apply this process, even in this rather vague form, from our own civilization, Western civilization, when we can see that certain modifications are needed. Like other civilizations, our civilization began with a period of mixture of cultural elements from other societies, formed these elements into a culture distinctly its own, began to expand with growing rapidity as others had done, and passed from this period of expansion into a period of crisis. But at that point, the pattern changed. In more than a dozen other civilizations, the age of expansion was followed by an age of crisis, and this in turn by a period of universal empire in which a single political unit ruled the whole extent of civilization. Western civilization, on the contrary, did not pass from the age of crisis to the age of universal empire, but instead was able to reform itself and entered upon a new period of expansion. Moreover, Western civilization did this not once, but several times. It is this ability to reform or reorganize itself again and again which made Western civilization the dominant factor in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. As we look at the three stages forming at the central portion of the life cycle of a civilization, we can see a common pattern. The age of expansion is generally marked by four kinds of expansion. 1, of population. 2, of geographic area. 3, of production. 4, of knowledge. The expansion of production and the expansion of knowledge give rise to the expansion of population, and the three of these together give rise to the expansion of geographic extent. This geographic expansion is some of importance to us because the civilization is a kind of nuclear structure made up of an older core area, which had existed as part of the civilization even before the period of expansion, and a newer peripheral area, which became part of the civilization only in the period of expansion and later. If we wish, we can make an additional refinement, a third semi-peripheral area between the core area and the fully peripheral area. These various areas are readily discernible in various civilizations of the past and have played a vital role in historic change in these civilizations. In Mesopotamian civilization, 6000 BC to 300 BC, the core area was the lower valley of Mesopotamia. The semi-peripheral area was the middle and upper valley, while the peripheral area included the highlands surrounding this valley and more remote areas like Iran and Syria and even Anatolia. The core area of Cretan civilization, 3500 BC to 1100 BC, was the island of Crete, while the peripheral area included the Aegean Islands and the Balkan coasts. In classical civilization, the core area was the shores of the Aegean Sea. The semi-peripheral area was the rest of the northern portion of the eastern Mediterranean Sea, while the peripheral area covered the rest of the Mediterranean shores and ultimately Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. In Canaanite civilization, 2200 BC to 100 BC, the core area was the Levant, while the peripheral area was in the western Mediterranean at Tunis, western Sicily, and eastern Spain. The core area of Western civilization, AD 400 to sometime in the future, has been the northern half of Italy, France, the extreme part of Western Germany, and England. The semi-peripheral area has been Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula, while the peripheral areas have included North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and some other areas. This distinction of at least two geographic areas in each civilization is of major importance. The process of expansion, which begins in the core area, also begins to slow up in the core at the time when the peripheral area is still expanding. In consequence, by the latter part of the age of expansion, the peripheral areas of civilization tend to become wealthier and more powerful than the core area. Another way of saying this is that the core passes from the age of expansion into the age of conflict before the periphery does. Eventually, in most civilizations, the rate of expansion begins to decline everywhere. It is this decline in the rate of expansion of a civilization which marks its passage from the age of expansion to the age of conflict. This latter period is the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all the periods of the life cycle of a civilization. It is marked by four chief characteristics. A. It is a period of declining rate of expansion. B. It is a period of growing tensions and class conflicts. C. It is a period of increasingly frequent and increasingly violent imperialist wars. And D. It is a period of growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and otherworldliness. All these phenomena appear in the core area of a civilization before they appear in more peripheral portions of society. The decreasing rate of expansion of the age of conflict gives rise to other characteristics of the age, in part at least. After the long years of the age of expansion, people's minds and their social organizations are adjusted to expansion, and it's a very difficult thing to readjust these to the decreasing rate of expansion. Social classes and political units within the civilization try to compensate for the slowing of expansion through normal growth by the use of violence against other social classes or against other political units. From this come class struggles and imperialist wars. The outcomes of these struggles within the civilization are not of vital significance for the future of the civilization itself. What would be of such significance would be the reorganization of the structure of the civilization so that the process of normal growth would be resumed. Because such reorganization requires the removal of the causes of the civilization's decline, the triumph of one social class over another, or of a unit of political order of another within the civilization will not usually have any major influence on the causes of the decline and will not, except by accident, result in such a reorganization of structure as it will give rise to a new period of expansion. Indeed, the class struggles and the imperious wars of the Age of Conflict will probably serve to increase the speed of the civilization's decline because they dissipate capital and divert wealth and energies from productive to non-productive activities. In most civilizations, the long-drawn agony of the Age of Conflict finally ends in a new period, the Age of Universal Empire. As a result of the imperialist wars of the Age of Conflict, the number of political units in the civilization are reduced by conquest. Eventually, one emerges triumphant. When this occurs, we have one political unit for the whole civilization. Just at the core area passes from the Age of Expansion to the Age of Conflict earlier than the peripheral areas. Sometimes the core area is conquered by a single state before the whole civilization is conquered by the Universal Empire. When this occurs, the core empire is generally a semi-peripheral state, while the Universal Empire is generally a peripheral state. Thus, Mesopotamia's core was conquered by semi-peripheral Babylonia about 1700 BC, while the whole of Mesopotamian civilization was conquered by a more peripheral Assyria about 725 BC, replaced by a fully peripheral Persia about 525 BC. In classic civilization, the core area was conquered by a semi-peripheral Macedonia around 336 BC, while the whole civilization was conquered by peripheral Rome about 146 BC. In other civilizations in the Universal Empire has consistently been a peripheral state, even when there was no earlier conquest of the core area by a semi-peripheral state. In Mayan civilization, 1000 BC to AD 1550, the core area was apparently in Yucatan and Guatemala, but the Universal Empire of the Aztecs centered in the peripheral highlands of central Mexico. In Andean civilization, 1500 BC to 1600 AD, the core areas were on the lower slopes and valleys of the central and northern Andes, but the Universal Empire of the Incas centered in the highest Andes, a peripheral area. The Canaanite civilization, 2200 BC to 146 BC, had its core area in the Levant, but its Universal Empire, the Punic Empire, centered at Carthage in the western Mediterranean. If we turn to the Far East, we see no less than 3 civilizations. One of these earliest Sinic civilizations rose in the valley of the Yellow River after 2000 BC, culminated in the Qin and Han empires after the 200 BC, and were largely destroyed by Ural-Altaic invaders after AD 400. From this Sinic civilization, the same way in which classical civilization emerged from Cretan civilization or Western civilization emerged from classical civilization, there emerged 2 other civilizations. A. Chinese civilization, which began around AD 400, culminated in the Manchu Empire after 1644, and was disrupted by European invaders in the period 1790 to 1930. And B. Japanese civilization, which began around the time of Christ, culminated in the Tokugawa Empire after 1600, and may have completely disrupted by invaders of Western civilization in the century following 1853. In India, as in China, 2 civilizations have followed one another. Although we know relatively little about the earlier of the 2, the latter, as in China, culminated in a universal empire ruled by an alien and peripheral people. Indic civilization, which began around 350 BC, was destroyed by Aryan invaders around 1700 BC. Hindu civilization, which emerged from Indic civilization about 1700 BC, culminated in the Mughal Empire and was destroyed by invaders from Western civilization in the period of 15 to 1900. Turning to the extremely complicated area of the Near East, we can see a similar pattern. Islamic civilization, which began around AD 500, culminated in the Ottoman Empire in the period 1300 to 1600, and has been in the process of being destroyed by invaders from Western civilization since about 1750. Expressed in this way, these patterns in the life cycles of various civilizations may seem confused, but if we tabulate them, the pattern emerges with some simplicity. Once tabulated, a most extraordinary fact emerges. Of approximately 20 civilizations which have existed in all of human history, we have listed 16. Of these 16, 12, possibly 14, are already dead or dying. Their cultures are destroyed by outsiders able to come in with sufficient power to disrupt the civilization, destroy its established modes of thought and action, and eventually wipe it out. Of these 12 dead or dying cultures, 6 have been destroyed by Europeans, bearing the culture of Western civilization. When we consider the untold numbers of other societies simpler than civilizations which Western civilization has destroyed or is now destroying, societies such as the Hottentots, the Iroquois, the Tasmanians, the Navajo, the Caribs, and countless others, the full frightening power of Western civilization becomes obvious. One cause, although by no means the chief cause of the ability of Western civilization to destroy other cultures, rests on the fact that it has been expanding for a long time. This fact, in turn, rests on another condition to which we have already alluded: the fact that Western civilization has passed through 3 periods of expansion, has entered into an age of conflict 3 times. Each time has had its core area conquered almost completely by a single political unit, but has failed to go on to the age of universal empire. Because the confusion of the age of conflict, there emerged each time a new organization of society capable of expanding by its own organizational powers, with the result that the 4 phenomenal characteristics of the age of conflict, decreasing rate of expansion, class conflicts, imperialist wars, irrationality, were gradually replaced once again by the 4 kinds of expansion typical of an age of expansion: demographic, geographic, production, and knowledge. From a narrowly technical point of view, this shift from an age of conflict to an age of expansion is marked by a resumption of the investment of capital and the accumulation of capital on a large scale, just as the earlier shift from the age of expansion to the age of conflict was marked by a decreasing rate of investment and eventually by a decreasing rate of accumulation of capital. Western civilization began, as all civilizations do, in a period of cultural mixture. In this particular case, it was a mixture resulting from the barbarian invasions which destroyed classical civilization in the period 350 to 700. By creating a new culture from the various elements offered from the barbarian tribes, the Roman world, the Saracen world, and above all the Jewish world, quote-unquote Christianity, Western civilization became a new society. This society became a civilization when it became organized in the period 700 to 970, so that there is an accumulation of capital and the beginnings of the investment of this capital in new methods of production. These new methods are associated with the change from infantry forces to mounted warriors and defense, from manpower and thus slavery to animal power and energy use, from the scratch plow and 2-field, fallow agricultural technology of Mediterranean Europe to the 8-oxen gang plow and 3-field system of the Germanic peoples, and from the centralized, state-centered political orientation of the Roman world to the decentralized, private power, feudal network of the medieval world. In the new system, a small number of men, equipped and trained to fight, received dues and services from the overwhelming majority of men who were expected to till the soil. From this inequitable but effective defensive system emerged an inequitable distribution of political power, and in turn, an inequitable distribution of the social economic income. This, in time, resulted in an accumulation of capital, which, by giving rise to demand for luxury goods of remote origin, began to shift the whole economic emphasis of society from its earlier organization in self-sufficient agrarian units, manors, to commercial interchange, economic speculation, and by the 13th century, to an entirely new pattern of society, with towns, a bourgeois class spreading literacy, growing freedom of alternative social choices, and new, often disturbing thoughts. From all this came the first period of expansion of Western civilization, covering the years 970 to 1270. At the end of this period, the organization of society was becoming a petrified collection of vested interests. Investment was decreasing, and the rate of expansion was beginning to fall. Accordingly, Western civilization, for the first time, entered upon the age of conflict. In this period, the time of the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, the Great Heresies, and severe class conflicts lasted about 1270 to 1420. By the end of it, efforts were arising from England and Burgundy to conquer the core of Western civilization. But just at that moment, a new age of expansion, using a new organization of society which circumvented the old vested interests of the feudal manorial system, began. This new age of expansion, frequently called the period of commercial capitalism, lasted from about 1440 to about 1680. The real impetus to economic expansion during the period came from efforts to obtain profits by the interchange of goods, especially semi-luxury or luxury goods, over long distances. In time, this system of commercial capitalism became petrified into a structure of vested interests in which profits were sought by imposing restrictions on the production or interchange of goods rather than by encouraging these activities. These new vested interest structure, usually called mercantilism, became such a burden on economic activities that the rate of expansion of economic life declined and even gave rise to a period of economic decline in the decades immediately following 1690. The class struggles and imperialist wars engendered by this age of conflict are sometimes called the Second Hundred Years' War. The wars continued until 1815, and the class struggles even later. As a result of the former, France by 1810 had conquered most of the core of Western civilization. But here, just as it occurred in 1420, when England had also conquered part of the core of civilization toward the latter portion of the age of conflict, the victory was made meaningless because a new period of expansion began. Just as commercial capitalism had circumvented the petrified institution of the feudal manorial system, chivalry, after 1440, so industrial capitalism circumvented the petrified institution of commercial capitalism, mercantilism, after 1820. The new age of expansion which made Napoleon's military political victory of 1810 impossible to maintain had begun in England long before. It appeared as the agricultural revolution about 1725 and as the industrial revolution at about 1775. But it did not get started as a great burst of expansion until 1820. Once started, it moved forward with an impetus such that the world had never seen before, and it looked as if Western civilization might cover the whole globe. The dates of this third age of expansion might be fixed at 1770, 1929. Following upon the second age of conflict of 1690 to 1815. The social organization which was at the center of this new development might be called the industrial capitalism. In the course of the last decade of the 19th century, it began to become a structure of vested interests to which we might give the name monopoly capitalism. As early, perhaps, as 1890, certain aspects of a new age of conflict, the third in Western civilization, began to appear, especially in the core area, with a revival of imperialism, of class struggle, of violent warfare, and of irrationalities. By 1930, it was clear that Western civilization was again of an age of conflict. But by 1942, a semi-peripheral state, Germany, had conquered much of the core of the civilization. That effort was defeated by calling into the fray of a peripheral state, the United States, and another outside civilization, the Soviet Society. It is not yet clear whether Western civilization will continue along the path marked by so many earlier civilizations, or whether it will be able to reorganize itself sufficiently to enter upon a new fourth age of expansion. If the former occurs, this age of conflict will undoubtedly continue with the fourfold characteristics of class struggle, war, irrationality, and declining progress. In this case, we shall undoubtedly get a universal empire in which the United States will rule most of Western civilization. This will be followed, as in other civilizations, by a period of decay, and ultimately, as the civilization grows weaker, by invasions and the total destruction of Western culture. On the other hand, if Western civilization is able to reorganize itself and enters upon a fourth age of expansion, the ability of Western civilization to survive and go on increasing prosperity and power would be bright. Leaving aside this hypothetical future, it would appear thus that Western civilization in approximately 1500 years has passed through 8 periods. Thus, 1. Mixture, 350 to 700. 2. Gestation, 700 to 970. 3. First expansion, 970 to 1270. 4. First conflict, 1270 to 1440. Core Empire, England, 1420. 5. Second expansion, 1440 to 1690. 6. Second conflict, 1690 to 1815, Court Empire, France, 1810. 7. Third Expansion, 1770 to 1929. 8. Third Conflict, 1893 to present, Court Empire, Germany, 1942. The two possibilities which lie in the future can be listed as follows. Reorganization, 9. Fourth Expansion, 1944 to present. Or continuation of the process. 10. Universal Empire, the United States. 6. Decay. 7. Invasion, the end of civilization. From the list of civilizations previously given, it becomes somewhat easier to see how Western civilization was able to destroy, or still is destroying, the cultures of 6 other civilizations. In each of these 6 cases, the victim civilization had already passed the period of universal empire and was in the deep age of decay. In such a situation, Western civilization played a role as an invader, similar to that of the Germanic tribes in classical civilization, by the Dorians in Cretan civilization, by the Greeks in Mesopotamian or Egyptian civilization, by the Romans in Canaanite civilization, or by the Aryans in Indic civilization. The Westerners who burst upon the Aztecs in 1519, on the Incas in 1534, on the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, on the Manchu Empire after 1790, on the Ottoman Empire after 1774, and on the Tokugawa Empire after 1853, were performing the same role as the Visigoths and other barbarian tribes to the Roman Empire after 377. In any case, the results of the collision of the two civilizations, one in the age of expansion and the other in the age of decay, was a foregone conclusion. Expansion would destroy decay. In the course of its various expansions, Western civilization has collided with only one civilization that was not already in the stage of decay. This exception was its half-brother, so to speak, the civilization now represented by the Soviet Empire. It is not clear what stage this Orthodox civilization is in, but it is clearly not in the stage of decay. It would appear that Orthodox civilization began as a period mixture in 500 to 1300 and is now in its second period of expansion. The first period of expansion, covering 1500 to 1900, had just begun to change in age of conflict, 1900 to 1920, when the vested interests of the society were wiped away by the defeat at the hands of Germany in 1917 and replaced by a new organization of society which gave rise to a second age of expansion since 1921. During much of the last 400 years, culminating in the 20th century, the fringes of Asia have been occupied by a semicircle of old dying civilizations: Islamic, Hindu, Chinese, and Japanese. These have been under pressure from Western civilization coming in from the oceans and from the Orthodox civilization pushing outward from the heart of the Eurasian landmass. The oceanic pressure began with Vasco da Gama in India in 1498, culminated aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay in 1945, and still continued with the Anglo-French attack on Suez in 1956. The Russian pressure from the continental heartland was applied to the inner frontiers of China, Iran, and Turkey from the 17th century to the present. Much of the world's history in the 20th century has arisen from the interactions of these three factors: the continental heartland of Russian power, the shattered cultures of the buffered fringe of Asia, and the oceanic powers of Western civilization. Well, that was a lot of history, tightly compacted. To review briefly, I'm asking myself, what age is Western civilization in right now? Is it in the age of growth and expansion, or decline? Remember where Quigley said, "It is not yet clear whether Western civilization will continue along the path marked by so many earlier civilizations, or whether it will be able to reorganize itself sufficiently to enter upon a new fourth age of expansion. If the former occurs, this age of conflict will undoubtedly continue with the fourfold characteristics of class struggle, war, irrationality, and declining progress." Quigley clearly defines the signs of expansion and the signs of decline. The signs of decline are 1. Class struggles.
The top 1% now own more of this nation's wealth than the bottom 90% combined.
Financial pressures of the middle class. It's part of what you're hearing from voters and on the campaign trail this year.
Sign number 2. War.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in. You gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
We came up to a smaller building, and my squad was tasked with taking this building, and the doorway, there was fire coming out of the doorway, machine gun fire, and from the windows. So I had an attachment of SMAs, which are rockets. So we hit it, and then we stormed into the building, and there was 2 looked about a 14-year-old kid, a 6-year-old kid, and a young, maybe this could have been her husband, I couldn't tell because he was so messed up, and a woman that was bleeding, but not severely, and all she was screaming, "Why? Laish, Laish." I leaned up against the wall, and as my rest of my Marines cleared through the building, and I sat there with the corpsman trying to do something about it. But I started to cry. I wanted to rip my hair out, what hair I did have, and go nuts. And the woman, seeing my reaction, came up to me and put her hand on my cheek and said, "Inshallah," which is God's will. Because these people over there, it doesn't matter what bad things happen to them, that they can accept it right away as God's will because they're deeply religious. But no, it wasn't God's will. It was my fucking order. I gave the order to fire those rockets into that building, and I killed her family.
Between 1989 and 2001, the United States intervened roughly every 2.5 years with some significant force, beginning with Bush's invasion of Panama and moving on from there. Different presidents, some of them are called realists, some of them are called idealists, some of them are called neocon, what have you. They all did the same thing.
Well, I have to live with that decision.
The third sign, irrationality.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Benghazi was a spontaneous reaction as a consequence of a video.
Democrats wanted to stop him and hit on this idea that maybe he wasn't born in the United States and wasn't eligible.
Russia, Putin, Russia.
The fourth sign is declining progress. But I do not believe that you can call our current state of affairs a declining progress. The only way I have reasonably seen people make an argument of the declining progress of the USA is when we are being compared to China. We face stagnant wages, but there have been massive increases in productivity over the years. Most of this is displayed in class struggles where the gains of the increases all went to the top. The next decade will be crucial to deciding the path that Western civilization will take. Will we become bogged down in wars that consolidate our power and build the dreaded universal empire? Or can we be smart and find a way out of the age of conflict and set foot upon a new age of innovation and growth? This video has been a little bit of a downer, so I'm including here Mark Blythe, professor of political economics at Brown University's strategy for maybe giving us a bit of a fix and boosting the economy for the future.
What's an ordinary working bloke to do? That's a really, really good question. It depends where you are. It depends where you are in the life cycle. It depends how if you can move. There's lots of things like that. But there's also, hopefully it's not an individual problem. And what we spent the past 3 days doing at the summer school was thinking about all the things that could be done. Now, you know, the most obvious one is tax the rich, right? But that's kind of difficult to do and old and doesn't really work. And you've got tax havens and an entire legion of accountants to stop these things working, right? But there's loads of things that you can do to make things much, much better. But they tend to be solutions that aren't for right now. They're multi-year, if not generational, right? So one of the ideas, because I'm deeply concerned about basically millennials, right? Here's why. They don't have any money and they're already in debt. And we didn't have enough of them to pay your pensions. So we need to basically transfer assets, either transfer assets from your generation to their generation, or alternatively, make new ones for them. So you got all the stuff about millennials, all they care about is eating avocados, they don't like cars, whatever, right? No, they basically can only eat avocados and they can't afford a car. It's just a very different proposition, right? So one of the ideas that I like that we're kicking around is the notion of a citizens' wealth fund. So you know sovereign wealth funds, basically the export earners have all this cash and then they buy equities and airfields and all that sort of shit, make money off it. Saudi Arabia's, Abu Dhabi got one, Norway has one, it's a classic example, right? But everybody could have one. So imagine this, imagine I'm Britain and there's a financial crisis. When there's a financial crisis, everybody who's got equities, shares, sells them because they don't want to be caught with something that's worth less the next day. Right? So it's an exaggerated depreciation. Now, what is it they want to buy? They want to buy gold, but there isn't enough of it. And the problem with gold is it's a fear index. At the end of the day, you still have to turn it into money. Right? So you want to have something that's cash-like, only is safe. It's called government debt. That's why you were able to sell so much in the crisis and still have negative interest rates on government debt. So basically, bond prices and interest rates move inversely. The more demand there is for it, the less the government has to offer an interest, and the more the price of the bond goes up. So if I'm the British government, it's a big financial crisis. Everybody with equities goes, and the stock market starts to fall. I say, would you like some gilts, some government bonds? And they go, yes, please. Well, if I issue 20% of GDP extra in bonds, I'll be able to sell all those without paying any extra interest at all. Let's say I take the cash that I get from that and I buy all of the equities that these people have dumped, because I have long time horizons and you don't. Only this time, I don't give them back. I put them into a special box that's completely away from the government, that has a long-term fund objective of investment. After about 6 years, it's 6% a year, because that's what these funds usually make, so 4% without inflation. Hell, there's no inflation, it's 6% real. I ride that called equity premium. I can pay back the whole 20%. Run that out for 10 to 15 years, I can make 20% of GDP. And I can just drop that to millennials by the time that they're 35 years old and say, all those student debts, gone. Can't afford the house in London? There's your deposit. Want to start a business? There you go. That's just one of the smart things you can do. And did I need to tax you to get that? No. So there's so many creative things we could do. We just lack a political class that has the imagination to do it. That's the number one problem. They're either posers, like the guy that you've got in charge just now, who's just a vacuous poser with a tattoo, if I may be frank. Or there are people like him who are living in the past, but has the right ideas in some ways. Or there are people who are on the right, who really understand what concerns people, but in my opinion, oftentimes have the wrong solutions for what concerns people. So we just have a talent problem. We have a talent problem at the top. And that's not an accident. You think about who's been paying these clowns for the past 20 years. It's the people who've got all the assets. So that's question number one.
Well, I hope that creative idea from Professor Blythe gives you a little bit of hope, as it does me, for sure. You know, there's a lot of different things that we could do if we could just, turn on the brain power of humanity at the top again. And, one of the reasons that it's been shut down is because societies, as they coalesce and as they grow old, they become victim to people that game them. We've been in that situation before, back in the early 1900s when we had Teddy Roosevelt and the trust busting, or, even Harry Truman, when the industrialists came to him and asked him to roll back parts of the New Deal. He told them that, these societies in Europe are doing some interesting things with socialized medicine and stuff. Maybe I'll go over there and take a look at that, and then I'll just put that on the headlines every night in front of the American people. What do you think of that? And they had to back down. So, Harry Truman, if you don't remember, was a card shark. Took Churchill for thousands. And, I've found, as I think most of us have, that changing the world around us starts by changing the world that we see in front of the mirror. Maybe we don't need a Teddy Roosevelt so much now as we need a Teddy Roosevelt, that you get involved. I change the way that I think about things. Well, thanks for watching Old Hollywood Briar. For those of us who made it all the way to the end, your gift is this bit of knowledge. Professor Carroll Quigley wrote this book, published in 1966. He claimed to have access to the confidential historical papers of the most influential people on the planet. In Japanese society, many know about the history of the power of the Meiji over the emperor, but the most have never heard of the Genro, which some historians posit was a sort of guy behind the guy behind the guy. Anyway, Carroll Quigley wrote this book based on what he claimed were the historical documents of the Genro of Western civilization at the time. The book encompasses the entirety of world history up until now and takes slightly longer to read than the Bible. If I continue to make a vlog like stuff like this, needs must that it have some bit of purpose, so I might include a bit more of it. Thanks for watching Old Hollywood Briar. Have a great day.
Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the road, her beauty and the moonlit overthrew you. She tied you to her kitchen chair, and she broke your throne, and she cut your hair, and from your lips she drew it. Hallelujah. Yeah. I used to live alone before I knew ya, and I've seen you fly on the marble arch, and love is not a victory march, it's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. Hallelujah. What's really going on below, but now you never show me that, do ya? Remember when I moved in you, and the holy dove was moving too, and every breath we drew was hallelujah. Hallelujah. somebody that you hear at night, and it's not somebody who's seen the light. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. 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 Hallelujah.
and a comb and a brush and a bowl full of mush and a quiet old lady who is whispering, hush. I appreciate this audience. Good night, room. Good night, light and the red balloon.